three areas that we want to challenge convention around: how we work, how we lead, and how we structure our companies. So let's start with how we work. For those of you that can't read the graphic, it says our biggest challenge is the time zone difference. In New York, it's 2:45, but in our headquarters, it's 1974. I know this is a cartoon, but everybody can relate to this. In fact, it's rare that anybody sees this cartoon and says, I don't get it, right? Most people can relate to this within their companies, right? Why is that? Why is it that we all relate to this within our organizations, right? We all know that it's true. Another fascinating statistic that we keep hearing about is this lack of engagement in the workplace, right? The fact that only 13% of employees within our workplace are actually engaged and show up with, meaning and purpose to do the jobs that they want to do. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a big fan of the show The Walking Dead, and this freaks me out. Because what this means is that we are living in a real-life zombie apocalypse scenario. We have 80+% of employees that are showing up for a paycheck that could care less about what they're doing, who they're working with, why they're working, what your company stands for, or who your customers are, right? This is a huge, huge number. We should be freaking out. It's a very, very scary statistic. So I have a theory for why I think a lot of this is happening, right? Why are so many employees disengaged at work? And I think it ultimately comes down to this. How our organizations are changing is not keeping up with the pace of how the world of work is changing. The world of work is changing at a much more rapid pace than our organizations can handle. And what happens is, as that gap grows, so does the employee engagement divide. As employees, we have certain expectations when we come into work.
Hey, really quick, sorry to interrupt you, but did you know that 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed? Do me a favor, subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you can get notified when more videos just like this one are released. And now, let's get back to the content.
And more, as those expectations aren't met, and as we start to feel that we're working in an outdated company, we become more and more disengaged. Why is it, for example, that employees need to get managerial approval to buy pens or a new chair, right? Why do we have all these different types of things within our organizations? We have all sorts of outdated policies and approaches and things that we want to get done. But it's really interesting, depending on how far back you want to go around management. Most people think that modern management started within the last 150 years or so. The fundamental role of management, the whole reason for why management was created, was to make sure that somebody was there so that when employees show up, that one person can make sure that they do their jobs and don't get in trouble, right? The goal of the manager was to make sure that employees show up to work every day to do the same job over and over and over and over again. That was the goal of a manager. That's it. There was no focus on engagement, on ideation, and on innovation. None of that stuff, right? They didn't care, right? The goal of a manager was just to make sure that the employees stay out of trouble and do their jobs. That's it. And this notion of management and this concept of doing the same thing over and over and just making sure that employees stay out of trouble is carried into our organizations, right? It's carried into many of our organizations today. And unfortunately, that's how many people still manage. Not all, right? I mean, there are a lot of great companies that are starting to do things differently. But for the majority of companies, that's how they manage, right? That's how they structure and that's how they build their companies. And today we're starting to rethink a lot about what that means. So I found this to be very, very interesting, and I think it's very, very telling for where many of our organizations are today, right? And this is our current work week, right? We have the Monday morning blues, terrible Tuesdays, hump day Wednesday, thirsty Thursday, where we drink heavily and try to cope with the week that has just passed. And then on Fridays, we are so happy, for thank goodness it's Friday. We are overjoyed that the weekend is coming. This is how many employees feel within our organizations. This is why we have such a high employee disengagement rate. The majority of employees, the way that we used to work many years ago was all with our hands, right? Supply chain, stuff like that. We're now seeing a huge shift to using our brains, to the knowledge worker, to the learning worker, right? A big shift that we haven't seen happen in the past. So these are some of the things that the smart and progressive organizations around the world are starting to do. Leveraging flexible work environments, encouraging employee innovation, shaping career paths, using collaborative technologies, autonomy, and sharing. And I'll give you a couple examples of what some of these companies are doing. Let's start with leveraging flexible work environments. Curious, how many of your organizations here have flexible work environments? Okay, awesome. So you're already starting to see this happen within your organizations. What about encouraging employee innovation? How many of your organizations encourage employee innovation? Okay, great. So my favorite example of that is Whirlpool. And most people don't typically think of Whirlpool as this type of a unique and engaged and innovative organization, but they are. And they're one of the few organizations around the world that make innovation everyone's job, right? They have a process, they teach, they educate, they train employees on how to innovate within the workplace. How many of your organizations are using collaborative technologies? Okay, that's great. So a lot of organizations are also starting to use platforms like SAP Jam to connect and engage employees around the world and bring in customers and suppliers into having relevant conversations. Flexible work environments has been probably a key cornerstone for a lot of organizations. And the reason for that is that a lot of employees entering the workplace are now saying that they would be willing to take up to a 9 or 10% pay cut to be able to leverage a flexible work environment. HR professionals around the world are saying leveraging flexible work environments is one of the key ways that they're able to attract top talent, right? So we have to rethink how we work, right? Work is no longer just about employees driving an hour each way to get to work, showing up in an office from 9 to 5, checking email 20, 30 times a day, going to meetings, right? When we think about most of our days, of how an employee's day is typically structured, we wake up at 6:30, 7 o'clock, get the kids ready for school, drop them off at school, go to work, check email, go to a meeting, check email again, go to lunch, check email, another meeting, right? That's how our days are typically structured. Who wants to guess what's the number one thing that we do when we wake up in the morning? Check email. What's the number one thing we do before we go to bed at night? Check email, right? Just because we're always connected doesn't mean we're always available. So we really need to challenge this idea of how we're working within our organizations and really start to think about what we can do differently, right? How can we challenge convention within the workplace? The second area that we need to challenge convention around is how we lead and the types of leaders that we have within our organizations. So these are some of the things that progressive organizations are doing. One example that I'd like to touch on is from the CEO of ING Direct Canada. And his name is Peter Aceto, A-C-E-T-O. And not too long ago, and they're by the way, they're using a collaborative platform within their company. And not too long ago, he went publicly in front of his whole company, and he said, and this is what he called it, I'm giving my employees the right to bitch, right? It's exactly what he called it. And basically what he said is that I want all the employees that work here to tell me what you don't like about working here. Tell me what you're frustrated with. Tell me what you don't like. Tell me what upsets you. Just give me everything. And at first, employees were a little skeptical. They're like, it's like the quickest way to get fired. The first people that respond are the ones that get canned. But slowly and surely, people started to respond, right? Managers jumped on board. Employees jumped on board. And he had hundreds and hundreds of comments from employees that were telling him everything that they didn't like and everything they were frustrated with. And employees were coming up with all sorts of things, right? Everything from strategic initiatives to the fact that they didn't have hash browns on the breakfast menu cafeteria. And when I spoke with Peter, I said, look, a lot of these ideas aren't groundbreaking, right? I mean, just because you bring back hash browns to your breakfast menu cafeteria isn't really going to change much at your company, right? It's not going to make you more profitable. It's not going to save you any money. Why bother? And he said that the main reason why he's doing that is to build trust within his organization, right? If employees feel that they can come to him with their problems, it creates a culture of trust and collaboration within the company, right? It's a very counterintuitive way to lead, right? It's a great example of challenging convention. Because most managers within organizations would never do that, right? This notion of embracing vulnerability is something that we're starting to see within the workplace. We're also seeing this notion of serving employees, right? Again, the traditional idea of a manager was to make sure that employees showed up to work every day, got their jobs done, and went home and didn't cause any problems, right? Today, the progressive and forward-thinking organizations see managers as employees that are serving other employees, right? The role of the manager is to remove obstacles from the path of others. Practicing distributed decision-making is a big one that we're starting to see within a lot of organizations, right? When we think of how decisions get done within most organizations, it's typically managers that sit together, make decisions, and then pass that off to the rest of the organization. A good example here is TELUS. They're a telecommunications company based in Canada. I think they have around 30,000 plus employees. The way that all decisions get done at this organization is collaboratively and collectively, right? Managers sit down with employees to make decisions. Managers don't just make decisions and tell everybody else what to do. And at TELUS, their engagement levels have skyrocketed, right? I think they were in the 20 or 30 percentile a couple years ago, and now they're up to the 70 or 80th percentile for where they've become as far as an engaged company. So we're starting to see a lot of really, really interesting things. Another key area that we're seeing is around this idea of earning leadership within the company, right? Typically, most people associate being a manager with being a leader, right? You got promoted to that role, so you are a leader. That's not always the case. I think the best example of this is looking at financial institutions. Years ago, I worked at Morgan Stanley. I interned there for a few months when I was much younger. And the way that financial institutions typically work is they promote people based on how much money they bring into the company, right? If you bring a lot of money, you were promoted, you're an SVP, you now manage others. That doesn't make you a good leader, right? So a lot of organizations today, what we're seeing is that they're encouraging managers to earn leadership, right? You have to build followers. You have to earn that ability to lead other people. The third area around challenging convention is how we structure our organizations. And here are a couple things to start to think about, right? Operating like a small company, creating a distributed workforce, flatter hierarchies, etc. I've never spoken with a single organization that ever says to me, you know what we need at our company? We need more layers. I want more hierarchy. We have 11 layers. I want 30. Nobody ever says that. Right? Every company around the world is always trying to flatten, right? They always want to make communication and collaboration easier to get done. Creating a distributed workforce is crucial, right? And one of the interesting things that we're seeing around this is tapping into the freelancer economy, right? A lot of organizations are starting to tap into freelancers around the world, right? Regardless of where they are, to create this type of a distributed on-demand workforce. A big one that I think is very interesting is this notion of focusing on want instead of need. A lot of organizations always assume that employees needed to work there, right? In fact, the number one asset that a lot of organizations have to recruit top talent is cash. But what good is cash in an environment where employees are starting to value other things above money? Flexible work environments, doing meaningful work, right? What good is cash in that type of environment? It's not. So what's happening is that a lot of organizations are starting to shift their focus, right, to creating organizations where employees want to work there, not because they need to work there. I think this is a very, very fascinating thing that we're going to see much more of going forward. And this, of course, ties into corporate social responsibility, sustainability, those types of things as well. So we're starting to see very, very interesting things around how organizations are structured. Another area that we're seeing this is around how teams are built. Right? From large teams to smaller teams. Jeff Bezos from Amazon has this famous 2 pizza rule, right? If your team can't be fed by 2 pizzas, it's too big. I've been on conference calls where there are 40, 50 people from an organization from one team. So a lot of organizations, a lot of forward-thinking companies are starting to create smaller, nimble, more distributed and agile teams. As far as the diverse workforce goes, one of the other interesting things that we're seeing is more women in senior management roles. Right? This is a huge trend that we're seeing that I explore more in the book as well. Right? The progressive, forward-thinking organizations are starting to bring more women and more diversity into the organization. So we're really starting to rethink how organizations are structured. Does it make sense to have this giant, big monolith? Sometimes when I do workshops or I speak with clients, I always ask them, if you were to rebuild your company today, would you have it the same way that it is now? Nobody ever says yes. Right? Nobody ever says yes. People can always come up with new things that they want to do, with new progressive ways that their organizations should be structured and built. So again, the one big idea is challenging convention. The 3 areas to apply it to: how we work, how we lead, and how we build our organizations.